Winston S. Churchill, The World Crisis, Volume 3, Appendix O, Tank Minutes. Tank Requirements to Mr. Layton, August 3, 1917. Let me have on a single sheet of paper the following broad facts about the tank program, actual and prospective. How many tanks and of what patterns are to be ready month by month for the next 12 months? By whom and to what extent have these programs been approved? How much steel do they require? How much do they cost? How much labor, skilled and unskilled, do they require in these 12 months? What are the principal limiting factors in material and class of labor? Apart from the number of tanks, what quantity of spares and what maintenance plant are required? Give the money value or weights of materials or proportion of labor required, whichever of the three is the most convenient and representative. Let me know the number of people in the tank department, the principal salaries paid, and the aggregate of salaries paid per annum. Show particularly any part of tank production which overlaps aeroplane production, that is, any transferable margin, whether of skilled mechanics or of ball bearings, etc., in which these two branches of production are clashing competitors. Show also the proportion of steel, of money, and of skilled and unskilled labor proposed to be absorbed in tank production in these 12 months, compared with the general budget of the ministry. I shall be quite content if many of these figures are approximate only. Special Tanks to Secretary and E. September 9, 1917. It ought to be possible to make a tank which could easily traverse the kind of inundations that are found on the Flanders front. It appears to me likely that no alterations in the structure of the tank would be required. All that would be necessary would be to make the belts which carry the track run round a rather larger circumference, and to utilize this increased circumference to obtain A. height to the extent of about 4 feet, and B. length as far as may be necessary to provide for unseen submerged ditches and cavities in the ground. In other words, it would be like putting a bogie under a tank and making the moving track run round the bogie as well as the tank. An amphibious tank is no substitute for this. It may have its place in some other tactical scheme, but it does not meet this particular need. Please therefore concentrate on the definite problem of fitting an underbody to existing tanks, which will enable them to cross the shallow inundations which protect the enemy on considerable and important sectors of the front. Inundations are supposed to be most effective from 18 inches to 2 feet deep, but as a matter of fact on the Flanders front they very often run to 3 and even 4 feet, and of course there are holes and ditches underneath. The irregularities of the ground cannot, however, compare with those which exist in any of the battlefronts, and I am confident that this is a problem that can not only be easily but swiftly solved. If this note does not convey a clear impression to your mind, pray consult me. I wish the subject to be examined and plans and drawings to be made as quickly as possible with resolute intention to solve the problem. 1. A serious effort must be made to face the question of the frustration of tanks by means of landmines and buried shells. We are making very large commitments in regard to tanks, and you must exercise foresight and vigilance to make sure that our efforts are not wasted. I have always anticipated that this method might be used, as would be seen from a study of a paper I wrote on this subject in December 1915. At the same time, I feel fairly confident that the means exist, or can be discovered, of overcoming this method of resisting tanks. Just as there is a parry to every thrust, so there is a feint to every parry, And if we grapple boldly with this problem now, I believe we shall overcome the misgivings lately excited in military minds, and also cope with the real danger should it manifest itself. 2. Let it first of all be observed that this danger to tanks does not affect their use in defensive war for counterattack, because then they will be operating over ground which the enemy has not had time to sow with mines. Therefore, so far as the defensive aspect of the present campaign are concerned, the position is not affected. 3. The only way to deal with these difficulties is by experiment. First of all, experiments should be made with landmines and buried shells to see what are the best possible ways of destroying tanks. Obviously, what is required is a fuse arrangement which will respond to a slow heavy pressure distributed over a considerable area and will, if possible, resist a violent blow. A shell with a sensitive fuse into which is fitted a broad metal framework or trellis work would seem to be indicated. The fuse could be arranged to stand all ordinary weights, but only to explode when the weights approximating to a tank or very heavy wagon were put upon it. 4. What kind of shell is required? Can you trust simply to the explosion to damage a structure like a tank, or must you strike the tank not merely with the force of the explosion, but with large pieces of metal which will break or bend or burr the links and underpart of the tank? If the latter should prove to be true, the mere burying of trench mortar bombs would seem to be ruled out and the difficulty of the problem sensibly increased. What weight of shell would be required? The explosion of a 12-inch shell would no doubt shatter a tank, but nobody could afford to sow the whole front with 12-inch shells. What would be the effect of a 9.2-inch shell? Is it certain that it would destroy a tank? Even sowing the front with 9.2-inch shells would be an extraordinarily difficult and costly business. The 6-inch shell would be a much more manageable proposition from the point of view of the defense, but would it be big enough? These points have got to be established, first of all by expert opinion and secondly by actual experiment. 5. It must be remembered that, whereas the Mark IV tank can only operate effectively on fairly limited areas on the front, the Mark VIII, on which we are counting for 1919, can go almost anywhere, and the statement often made that there are only a few sectors of the front where tanks can be used will not apply next year. On the contrary, part of the effectiveness of tanks in 1919 will be the surprise due to their appearing in all sorts of country hitherto judged inaccessible to them. We shall see them crossing canals by the lock gates, making their way across the most heavily shell-crumbed areas, traversing intersected and wooded country, climbing steep hills, crossing all manner of trenches, etc. The problem of stopping them by landmines will therefore be enormously extended, and to be safe, the whole front would have to be sown. Some calculations on this point should be made, on what would be involved in this for shells, trench mortar bombs or explosives. A single line of shells would clearly not be effective unless one were sown every tank breadth. They would probably have to be dotted checker-wise in 2 or 3 rows. Even so, once the locality of a minefield had been established by one tank being blown up, it is likely that the way through it would be revealed. It is almost inconceivable that the front should be completely defended by this elaborate and delicate device, or that having been sown, they would not get out of order. In fact, it is a plan much easier to talk of than to execute. Let it, however, be elaborated by officers who believe in it and are trying to put the argument for it at its very highest and give it the best possible chance of being effective. 6. We then cross over to the other side of the argument. How can the tank circumvent a minefield? We may disregard the possibility of the whole front being defended by large landmines. The demands on explosive would be far beyond what could be spared. But buried shells or trench mortar bombs are clearly the danger we must try to meet. It is necessary to establish at the outset the effect upon a Mark IV tank of a 6-inch shell buried at the right distance below the surface. I presume it would be buried at least 2 feet. This should be actually tried, and the effect upon the track links and underpart carefully noted. 7. There are, then, 2 methods of overcoming the difficulties which suggest themselves. First, exploding the shells before the tank reaches them. This might be done in various ways. Firstly, a tank might be equipped with a large steel hammer extending a considerable distance in front of it, say 20 feet, and when reaching a mine area, it could strike the ground heavy blows sufficient to spring off the shell. Secondly, our artillery could bombard any mine area once it had been located. This would probably spring all the mines in the neighborhood and enable other tanks to get through safely. Thirdly, could not the tank gun, if sufficiently depressed, test the suspicious ground in front of the tank by firing upon it? I do not know what pressures could be exerted by any of these agencies, or whether they are pressures to which a special fuse could be made insensible on account of their violence, while at the same time it would respond to mere weight. 8. Another method might consist in making a special tank, a proportion of which would be supplied to each tank battalion, which would be strong enough by reason of the armoring of its under portion to resist the explosion and thus clear away a minefield. Or again, an ordinary tank might push a heavy roller or series of rollers in front of it, or might carry them in a kind of tray from which they could be allowed to drop on the ground in front of the tank when the known limits of the minefield are reached. Or again, a vehicle might be designed which a tank could tow along with it, which, actuated by wires from the tank, could move ahead and by this way explode minefields. 9. The above crude ideas are only intended to excite the scientific mind and lead to the production of definite solutions. 2 committees should be formed without delay, one from the trench warfare and the other from the mechanical warfare department, who should study the attack of tanks by mines and the countermeasures against mines. They should acquaint each other with the fruits of their reflections and meet together to arrive at joint solutions. Materials and labor must be supplied to enable adequate experiments to be made at once. The closest liaison should be kept with the army. Much has been and is being done on the British front now to guard against the possible tank attacks. Let us have all this knowledge. Again, Bermicourt, footnote, the Tank Corps headquarters in France, end of footnote, must have many ideas how to overcome the mining difficulties. 10. Pray let me have, in the first instance, more definite proposals for setting these inquiries and experiments on foot. Winston S. Churchill.